They preached perfection, sculpted myths in uniforms, sold the world an image of unbreakable men. But behind the medals and speeches were trembling hands, shattered nerves, hidden scars, and bodies quietly failing. Welcome to the darkest irony of the Third Reich, where the architects of racial purity were often the ones most desperate to hide their own flaws. This isn't a story about power. It's a story about concealment, about pain repackaged as strength, and about what happens when a regime obsessed with physical perfection starts to fall apart from the inside out. Before we dive in, if you're into strange histories, buried truths, and the uncomfortable stuff they don't teach in school, hit that subscribe button. It helps more than you know. And while you're here, drop a comment below. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Midnight? 3 a.m.? Let's see who else is wide awake for this. 1. Adolf Hitler. He shook. That's the part they didn't show you. A persistent tremor in his left hand, small but relentless. In public, Hitler was staged like a pagan idol, motionless, messianic, chiseled into stillness by propaganda. But behind closed doors, the body beneath the myth was far less obedient. By the later years of the war, witnesses saw his hands clasped behind his back, not in defiance, but to steady the trembling. Some accounts describe a shuffle in his walk, or moments of vacant staring, signs that sparked speculation of Parkinsonism. But the records are patchy, and conveniently so. His personal physician, Theodor Morell, part snake oil salesman, part chemical enabler, flooded him with exotic drug cocktails. Vitamins, hormones, opiates, meth. All under the guise of natural therapies. Hitler called him my miracle man. Everyone else just called him suspicious. But the real miracle was visual. Newsreels, where his left side is almost never shown. Photos where his hand is cut out of frame. It wasn't just manipulation. It was curation. Nazi ideology demanded Aryan perfection, so its figurehead couldn't even twitch. And yet, he did. The man who demanded genetic purity may have been quietly dying of neurological decay. Of course it gets better. Wait until you see who they put in charge of propaganda. 2. Joseph Goebbels. Joseph Goebbels walked with a limp, but not in the way myths like to exaggerate. His right foot was twisted inwards, shortened and rigid, a condition known as clubfoot, caused either at birth or by childhood illness. He wore a special orthopedic boot and walked with a noticeable gait. In a regime obsessed with physical perfection, Goebbels was a paradox in tailored suits. He was sharp, venomous, and brilliant in all the worst ways. His oratory could ignite cities. But behind the podium, stage managers carefully framed every angle. He was almost never filmed from below the knees. Group photos were arranged with a magician's touch. Chairs, crops, coats draped just so. One propaganda director once joked off the record that the Reich's foot soldier couldn't walk straight. Official biographies skipped the limp entirely. Nazi newspapers referred to it once, vaguely, as a war injury. Except Goebbels had never served in combat. It didn't matter. He served something more valuable, a voice with fire in it, a mind that could bend crowds. The man who sold the world the myth of Aryan power was never physically whole himself. But then again, neither was the man in charge of the Luftwaffe. And if you're still here, 2 stories in and already deep in the contradictions, take a second to subscribe. This channel dives into the hidden, the haunting, and the historically uncomfortable. And since you're clearly the kind of person who watches this kind of thing all the way through, where are you tuning in from? And what time is it right now? Let's light up the comments with time zones and insomnia. 3. Hermann Göring. Hermann Göring wore medals like armor and uniforms like stage curtains. But if you looked closer, past the swagger, past the empire of self-indulgence, you'd see a man slowly rotting from the inside out. His morphine addiction began as a medical necessity, a prescription for wounds suffered during the failed beer hall putsch. But it didn't stop. For the next 20 years, he was rarely sober. At one point, his daily intake reached 100 pills. Some called it self-medication. Others just called it the Reichsmarshal's breakfast. Then there was the weight. Göring ballooned over the years, his face sagging into caricature, his breathing labored, his heart struggling. His uniforms had to be custom altered to preserve the illusion, padded, cinched, darkened in just the right places. Every public appearance was a battle against visible decline. He ruled the Luftwaffe and chaired the 4-year plan, a man at the center of war and economy, all while chemically dependent and medically failing. But propaganda never blinked. Photos were retouched, reports were sanitized. Göring the statesman, Göring the warrior, never Göring the addict. And yet, if addiction disqualified leadership, then what was going on inside the SS? 4. Heinrich Himmler. Heinrich Himmler believed in ancient runes, racial purity, and gastrointestinal supplements. As head of the SS, he engineered one of history's most methodical systems of cruelty, while privately fighting off recurring stomach cramps and nervous disorders. He had the constitution of a hypochondriac and the soul of a bureaucrat. Behind the hard stare and wire-rimmed glasses was a man obsessed with his digestion, prone to fainting at the sight of blood, and forever chasing herbal cures to ease the gnawing in his gut. He wasn't a warrior. He barely passed military training and flinched around guns. But he played the part of ideologue so well that nobody noticed how often he was sick. His personal physician prescribed homeopathic concoctions. He bathed obsessively. He followed restrictive diets, avoiding meat, alcohol, and eventually truth. His illnesses, very real, very chronic, were recast as monastic discipline. A man too pure, too focused, too spiritually elevated to enjoy common pleasures. The man who enforced sterilizations and murders in the name of physical perfection couldn't digest lunch without herbal tea and frequent rest. And still, he wasn't the most mentally unraveled man in Hitler's inner circle. That title belongs to the one who flew to Scotland in a homemade peace plan. 5. Rudolf Hess. Rudolf Hess boarded a plane in 1941, flew solo across enemy skies, and crash-landed in Scotland, uninvited, unannounced, and some say, unhinged. His self-styled peace mission stunned both Churchill and Hitler. But to those who knew him, it wasn't entirely surprising. Hess had long been unraveling. His health history read like a psychiatric textbook's footnotes. Paranoia, depression, memory lapses, and psychosomatic episodes. Even before the war, he carried a talisman around his neck, wore garlic against brain poisons, and believed the stars dictated fate. To the outside world, he was cast as a spiritual zealot, devoted, intense, and oddly quiet. But internally, he was falling apart. Hitler had already sidelined him before the flight, likely due to Hess's erratic behavior. After his capture, British doctors noted episodes of amnesia and delusion. Later in prison, Hess refused to see visitors, believing they were imposters. He spent over 4 decades behind bars, locked in both a cell and his own mind. The man who once stood at Hitler's side during the beer hall putsch ended up muttering to walls, convinced he was being poisoned by invisible enemies. But even Hess, spiraling as he was, kept his illness cleaner than the Reich's rational architect. 6. Albert Speer. Albert Speer was the Nazi who wanted to be remembered as an artist, a soft-voiced architect with steel in his veins and a blueprint for everything, including plausible deniability. At the Nuremberg trials, he played the part of the good Nazi, regretful, articulate, deeply misunderstood. But underneath the polished exterior, Speer was constantly unraveling. Throughout the war, he suffered recurring bouts of depression and psychosomatic illness. Insomnia, stomach pain, and episodes of numb detachment plagued him during the peak of his power. But he didn't talk about it. He buried it under efficiency. As Minister of Armaments, he ran the Nazi war machine like a corporate executive on the verge of a breakdown. His ailments were framed as symptoms of genius. Just stress, just the price of intellect. He had no taste for uniforms or shouting speeches. He preferred drafting tables in sterile corridors. But the price of building a war economy on slave labor seeped in, even if only through headaches and hollow silences. The man who kept the tanks rolling was quietly cracking, and the man he answered to next could barely hear his own orders. 7. Karl Dönitz. Karl Dönitz liked silence. It suited a submariner, and it suited a man who was slowly losing the ability to hear. Years spent around engines, depth charges, and the metallic thunder of naval warfare had taken their toll. By the time he rose to command the German Navy, Dönitz was already dealing with partial hearing loss. Subtle, progressive, and never publicly acknowledged. Orders had to be repeated. Conversations leaned closer. Meetings ran longer than necessary, but no one dared mention it. In a regime obsessed with visible strength, hearing loss was an inconvenience best ignored. It didn't fit the image of the Iron Admiral guiding wolf packs through the Atlantic. So the narrative focused on discipline and technical brilliance. When Dönitz became Hitler's successor for those final collapsing days of the Reich, the irony was almost theatrical. A man tasked with issuing final commands to a nation, struggling to catch every word spoken around him. There were no medical bulletins, no admissions, just quiet adaptations. Aides who leaned in, rooms arranged carefully, pauses filled with nods instead of questions. War wounds were acceptable, gradual decline was not. And if Dönitz strained to hear, the man directly beneath him strained to keep himself from shaking under the weight of obedience. 8. Wilhelm Keitel. Wilhelm Keitel looked like the perfect officer. Tall, formal, impeccably dressed. Inside he was a bundle of nerves wrapped in a uniform. Years of proximity to Hitler wore him down, not with explosions but with anxiety. He suffered from stress-induced tremors, chronic exhaustion, and what contemporaries politely described as nervous weakness. His hands shook during meetings. His voice faltered when challenged. He slept poorly, if at all. Keitel's condition wasn't dramatic enough to remove him, but it was humiliating enough to define him. Other generals mocked him behind his back, calling him a yes man, a man who saluted before thinking. But what they saw as cowardice was also collapse. The pressure of absolute loyalty, combined with fear of dismissal or disgrace, eroded him physically. Officially, Keitel's symptoms were blamed on overwork. The Reich needed devoted servants, not fragile ones. So his shaking hands became invisible, his mental strain folded into the myth of tireless command. He stood beside Hitler signing orders he barely questioned, his body broadcasting distress while his mouth obeyed. But Keitel's breakdown was only half the story. His operations chief was unraveling in quieter, more dangerous ways. 9. Alfred Jodl. Alfred Jodl was praised for his intellect and punished by it. As chief of operations, he lived inside maps, timetables, and impossible deadlines. The result was a man permanently deprived of rest. Chronic insomnia hollowed him out. His face grew drawn. His temper sharpened. Neurological stress symptoms crept in. Headaches, lapses in concentration, a constant agitation that never fully settled. In the Wehrmacht's culture of stoicism, sleep deprivation wasn't a problem. It was proof of dedication. Jodl's inability to rest was framed as commitment to the cause, not as a warning sign. He paced late into the night, replaying lost battles and rewriting plans that would never work. When mistakes were made, the answer was never rest, only more pressure. There are accounts of Jodl staring silently at briefings, as if the information had to push its way through fog. But he kept showing up. That was the requirement. The Reich didn't need healthy minds. It needed compliant ones. By the time the war turned decisively against Germany, Jodl was visibly spent, propped up by routine and denial. And if he seemed exhausted, the man who came next was already being physically carved by stress itself. 10. Ernst Kaltenbrunner. Ernst Kaltenbrunner didn't bother hiding his scars. He couldn't. Deep lines cut across his face, souvenirs from academic dueling, ritualized violence framed as honor among certain nationalist circles. In Nazi culture, these scars were supposed to signify toughness, masculinity, ideological purity. But Kaltenbrunner's were excessive, disfiguring, and unsettling. They pulled attention away from his eyes, which were cold and calculating, and toward the reality that his face had been physically altered long before he ever gained power. The propaganda machine tried to manage it. Photos were carefully lit, angles softened. Press images preferred distance. While officially praised as honor scars, they were quietly minimized. Too much visible damage contradicted the clean, idealized Aryan aesthetic. Strength was acceptable. Deformity was not. As head of the RSHA, Kaltenbrunner wielded enormous power, yet his appearance marked him as an outlier even among elites. He compensated with severity, voice sharpened, posture rigid, authority enforced through fear rather than charisma. His scars became both shield and warning sign, signaling a man already shaped by violence before he administered it bureaucratically. In a regime obsessed with purity, Kaltenbrunner's face told a story of sanctioned damage, but at least his pain was visible. The next man's suffering stayed buried beneath discipline, precision, and a carefully sharpened smile. 11. Reinhard Heydrich. Reinhard Heydrich was efficiency personified. Tall, athletic, meticulously groomed, he looked like the propaganda posters wanted every German to become. But beneath the image was a body that carried constant pain. Years of fencing left him with recurring injuries that never fully healed. Old wounds flared unexpectedly. Movement sometimes came with stiffness masked by rigid posture and controlled gestures. Heydrich did not complain. Pain, to him, was a weakness to be managed privately. He treated it like everything else, something to dominate. Medication was taken discreetly. Physical strain was ignored. His schedule remained brutal, his demeanor immaculate. The man who orchestrated terror across occupied Europe refused to let his body betray him. Publicly, he was the embodiment of control. Privately, he lived with discomfort that followed him into meetings, travels, and late-night planning sessions. The regime valued his mind, not his health. As long as orders flowed, the cost didn't matter. There is something unsettling about how well he functioned despite it. Pain didn't slow him down. It sharpened him. The suffering that might have softened another man seemed only to harden his resolve. But even Heydrich's discipline couldn't protect the system from collapse, and the man tasked with commanding armies would soon find his own body giving out under pressure. 12. Walter von Brauchitsch. Walter von Brauchitsch was supposed to be the calm center of the German army. As commander-in-chief of the Wehrmacht, he was meant to project authority, balance, and endurance. Instead, his body began to fail him under the weight of impossible expectations. He suffered from heart disease, chronic stress, and eventually a full nervous breakdown. The strain of managing Hitler's interference, failed campaigns, and constant fear of dismissal hollowed him out. By 1941, Brauchitsch was no longer functioning as a leader. He struggled with concentration. Fatigue clung to him. His health deteriorated rapidly, culminating in a collapse severe enough that he had to be removed from command. Officially, it was framed as illness. Unofficially, it was a quiet admission that even the highest-ranking officers were cracking. The public never saw a decline. There were no explanations, no confessions of weakness. He simply vanished from the spotlight, replaced without ceremony. The myth of the unbreakable German command had to be preserved, even if it meant discarding the men who could no longer hold themselves together. Brauchitsch survived the war, but his authority did not. And if a commander could be erased so easily, imagine what prolonged pressure did to the men trapped at the front, starting with one general whose surrender would become legendary. 13. Friedrich Paulus. Friedrich Paulus was a man built for procedures, not mythology. A meticulous planner, stiff in demeanor, and by all accounts temperamentally unsuited for battlefield improvisation. Yet in 1942, Hitler sent him into the furnace of Stalingrad and left him there to melt. The psychological toll was immense. As the Red Army closed in, Paulus began to fracture. Reports from inside his staff describe a man descending into detachment. Mood swings, silence, obsessive tidying of maps no longer relevant, and a hollow fixation on protocol, even as his army starved and froze. He suffered from chronic stress illness and what post-war observers labeled as situational depression. But in Nazi Germany, mental collapse wasn't allowed unless it was posthumous. So his withdrawal from reality was framed as fatigue, his despondence recast as solemn endurance. When he finally surrendered, against Hitler's direct order, propaganda branded him a traitor, conveniently ignoring that his condition had long been one of psychological collapse. The Reich needed statues, not humans. Paulus had quietly stopped being either. And yet, as he disappeared into Soviet captivity, another naval officer, older, arthritic, and barely able to stand, was still being wheeled out to parades as if nothing was wrong beneath the uniform. 14. Erich Raeder. Erich Raeder believed in maritime tradition, order, and dignity, ideals increasingly out of step with the chaos of the regime he served. As Grand Admiral of the Kriegsmarine, he cultivated an image of stony resilience. But behind closed doors, he was increasingly frail. Raeder suffered from progressive arthritis, a condition that made movement painful and increasingly restricted. His hands, once capable of naval precision, began to stiffen. His gait slowed. By the later years of the war, he made fewer appearances, and those he did were stage-managed, seated, framed carefully, and kept brief. The illness didn't fit the image. Raeder was meant to be a living embodiment of German naval strength, a bridge to old imperial glory. So his condition was hidden behind medals and maritime ceremony. Pain was downplayed. Disability was quietly managed. When he was finally removed in 1943, the excuse was political. Tension with Hitler, strategic disagreements. But insiders knew he could no longer physically perform the role. Still, he clung to formality like a life vest, never publicly admitting to the deterioration. It was the Nazi way. Collapse only mattered if it couldn't be cropped out of the frame. And for one field marshal, that collapse would come all at once, behind the wheel of a car with no frame left to crop. 15. Albert Kesselring. Albert Kesselring was called Smiling Albert, a nickname that aged poorly. The Luftwaffe field marshal had a reputation for charm, resilience, and brutal military effectiveness. But behind the grin was a man carrying serious physical trauma. Multiple car accidents left him with lingering injuries, fractured bones, internal damage, and eventually partial paralysis. For the final chapter of his military service, Kesselring wasn't walking into strategy briefings. He was being helped into them, or rolled in. The image was carefully preserved. He remained in uniform. He gave orders. He smiled. But beneath the presentation was a man fighting to retain control over his body, while still executing control over occupied territories. His injuries were reframed as valor, proof of sacrifice rather than symbols of fragility. And for a time that worked. His command of Italy's brutal defensive campaigns continued long after his body stopped cooperating. Post-war photos show a man propped up by myth as much as by AIDS. The charm was still there, but the autonomy wasn't. Kesselring became yet another contradiction, a commander who could no longer stand, still being used as a symbol of standing firm. But the next Nazi icon wasn't injured in a car crash. His wounds came from war and from something that might have gone deeper than shrapnel. 16. Erwin Rommel. Erwin Rommel was the poster child of Nazi military genius, at least to those who needed a myth. The Desert Fox was fast, brilliant, and charismatic, with a PR glow that even Allied forces acknowledged. But behind the legend was a man repeatedly injured in combat, beginning in World War I and continuing through World War II. Rommel suffered from lingering head trauma, severe concussions, and what many now interpret as neurological symptoms, dizziness, headaches, and unpredictable fatigue that worsened after each incident. These weren't battlefield scratches. They were cumulative blows to his nervous system. But publicly, his injuries were handled like script edits, never acknowledged unless they could be spun as proof of bravery. When he was medically evacuated from Normandy in 1944, after a British airstrike hit his car, the official story emphasized valor, not vulnerability. He'd taken a blow to the head, fractured his skull, and was visibly impaired afterward. Memory lapses, motor issues, mood changes. None of it fit the invincible commander image. So silence returned. The myth held. Rommel still smiled for photos. But if head trauma changed him, the next general masked his fragility behind paperwork and a heart that couldn't quite keep up with the blitzkrieg he helped design. 17. Heinz Guderian. Heinz Guderian was obsessed with speed. He was the intellectual force behind Germany's blitzkrieg doctrine, mobile, aggressive, overwhelming. His tanks moved fast, but his heart didn't. By the early 1940s, Guderian was suffering from heart disease, a condition that forced him into periods of medical leave. But in a regime where physical weakness was equated with ideological failure, his diagnosis was wrapped in euphemism. Command reshuffling, strategic reassignments, temporary sidelining, anything but the truth. Even off the battlefield, Guderian moved like a man under pressure. The weight of constant movement, internal political fights, and the gnawing need to stay indispensable kept him circling the edges of collapse. Heart problems were discussed only in private. Publicly, he remained the bold, assertive strategist who wrote books and barked orders. When questioned after the war, Guderian distanced himself from atrocities, casting himself as a soldier, not a policymaker. It was a recurring motif among the elite. Reframe the damage, recast the record, and keep the cameras angled upward. And just a few feet away from Guderian in Berlin's corridors of power, another man was straining to hear those orders through the dull silence of his own declining senses. 18. Hjalmar Schacht. Hjalmar Schacht was the financial wizard of the early Nazi era, the man who performed fiscal gymnastics to stabilize the German economy, while quietly cultivating an image of patrician calm. But by the mid-1930s, Schacht's body was no longer cooperating. He suffered from hearing loss, a condition he never publicly admitted, and cardiovascular disease that slowed him both mentally and physically. His decline was gradual, the kind that doesn't announce itself, but becomes visible in the way people lean in during meetings, repeat themselves, or start finishing your sentences for you. Schacht masked it well. He played the aloof intellectual, the refined economist above the Sturm und Drang of Nazi politics. But behind the performance was a man being edged out of relevance, not just politically, but physically. His hearing issues made negotiations more difficult. His energy faded. His famously cold demeanor began to look more like fatigue than detachment. He was eventually removed from the Reichsbank and pushed to the margins of the regime he once helped fund. And still, his condition remained a non-topic, because even silence had to be choreographed. But for the next man, silence was less a symptom than a consequence, of insomnia, of obsession, and of a nervous system worn thin by planning the unthinkable. 19. Franz Halder. Franz Halder lived inside his own mind, methodical, restrained, and increasingly threadbare. As chief of the Army General Staff, Halder's days were filled with maps, memos, and the slow corrosion of sleep. He suffered from chronic insomnia and nervous exhaustion, a fact not broadcast but whispered among aides who noticed the darkening circles and the clipped responses. Halder wasn't the kind of man who shouted. He wore his unraveling like a pressed uniform, clean on the outside, fraying at the seams. His stress wasn't just the kind that came from war. It was the kind that came from proximity to madness. Halder had to listen, daily, to Hitler's delusions, his micromanagement, his rhetorical storms. And then he had to turn those storms into orders. The mental contortions required to survive in that job, politically and psychologically, took a toll. He recorded everything in his diary with surgical detachment, but the symptoms bled through. Trembling hands, forgotten meals, a man shrinking into strategy. He was dismissed in 1942, officially for disagreements. But really Halder had burned out in silence. And if Halder's exhaustion was invisible, the next Nazi's instability was managed like a state secret, carefully edited out of sight, even while governing an entire occupied nation. 20. Hans Frank. Hans Frank wanted to be seen as an intellectual, a lawyer, a thinker, a man of order. But in occupied Poland, he ruled with brutal efficiency while quietly descending into instability. Behind the heavy drapes of Wawel Castle, Frank battled addictions and growing psychological distress. He exhibited erratic behavior, shifting between eloquent speeches and impulsive decisions. Some reports noted mood swings, compulsive habits, and bouts of detachment that looked a lot like mental collapse. But none of that reached the press. Inside Germany, Frank's image was curated with icy precision. His legal background was emphasized. His speeches were printed selectively. His personal issues, especially his dependency on medication, were buried beneath his title as Governor General. And that title carried weight. It allowed him to commit horrors bureaucratically while appearing, to the public, as just another official in polished boots. Later during the Nuremberg trials, Frank would weep and moralize. But during the war, his decline was a managed spectacle, kept off camera, out of mind. And if Frank blurred the line between delusion and governance, the next man crossed it with a limp that couldn't be hidden, no matter how tightly the cameras were cropped. 21. Arthur Seyss-Inquart. Arthur Seyss-Inquart was always a quiet man in the shadows of louder monsters. He spoke with calm precision, wore his uniform like an afterthought, and walked with a limp that told a quieter story. Decades earlier, he'd suffered a leg injury that left him with mobility problems for life. It wasn't just a slight impairment, it altered the way he moved, how long he could stand, and how frequently he appeared in public without assistance. But in Nazi imagery, Seyss-Inquart was rarely shown walking at all. Photos were tightly framed, speeches were sparse. His disability wasn't acknowledged by the regime, it was worked around. He held powerful positions, Chancellor of Austria during the Anschluss, Reich Commissioner in the occupied Netherlands. But even at the height of his influence, he remained visually absent from much of the public narrative. His physical limitations were managed by silence. He was a man whose job was to maintain illusion while quietly concealing his own truth. It fit perfectly with a system built on denial. But the next man didn't even have the benefit of silence. His entire public image cracked under the weight of his own despair, masquerading as artistic sensitivity. 22. Baldur von Schirach. Baldur von Schirach spent most of his adult life shaping youth. As the leader of the Hitler Youth, his job was to mold the next generation of Nazis into hard, obedient ideologues. But behind the carefully combed hair and poetic speeches was a man increasingly swallowed by depression. He suffered from anxiety and emotional instability throughout his tenure, traits which he carefully recast as artistic temperament. After all, von Schirach fancied himself a poet, a thinker, someone who belonged more in Goethe's salons than at mass rallies. His condition worsened as the war dragged on. He grew distant, erratic, isolated even from other party elites, But since he wasn't a frontline general or propaganda poster boy, his condition was quietly tolerated, as long as it didn't show. Public appearances were controlled. His emotional volatility was passed off as depth. Nazi Germany had little tolerance for mental illness, but it had room for theatrics if wrapped in highbrow aestheticism. Von Schirach wrote poems while deportations were carried out under his watch. He cried for culture, but not for people. A soft shell with hard duties. But the next man wasn't soft at all, at least not when he stood near rockets, until one exploded. 23. Wernher von Braun. Wernher von Braun was the golden boy of Nazi science, young, brilliant, and disturbingly apolitical. He smiled for the cameras beside the V-2 rocket, the world's first long-range guided missile, built with the blood and labor of prisoners. But his body bore one secret it never volunteered. In 1944, during a rocket test, something went wrong. An explosion tore through the facility, leaving von Braun with a serious arm injury that he kept hidden for as long as possible. There are conflicting reports about the extent. Some say fractured bones, others mention lasting mobility issues. What's consistent is that the injury never reached the public. No photos, no press. Within days, he was back on camera, perfectly groomed, coat over the arm, gestures minimized. For a regime obsessed with strength, the architect of vengeance weapons couldn't afford to look vulnerable. After the war, the injury was quietly forgotten, along with most of his Nazi affiliations. He reinvented himself in America, launched rockets to the moon, and smiled again, this time in English. But before that reinvention, there was another man whose image was rewritten post-mortem, remade into a martyr by those who needed his madness to look like meaning. 24. Dietrich Eckart. Dietrich Eckart was dead before the Reich truly rose, but his shadow stretched long. As one of Hitler's earliest mentors and co-author of Mein Kampf's ideological scaffolding, Eckart occupied a strange place in Nazi lore, part prophet, part prophetically unstable. He suffered from severe mental instability and chronic drug addiction, particularly morphine, during the last years of his life. His behavior became erratic, his writings increasingly fragmented, his relationships volatile. And yet, after his death in 1923, he was sanctified. The regime didn't remember Eckart as the addict who unraveled in rented rooms. They remembered him as a martyr of the cause, a spiritual predecessor to the Third Reich. Nazi biographies wiped his decline clean. His psychological deterioration was reframed as mystical insight. His dependence on morphine? Never mentioned. His delusions? Recast as visions. Eckart became the ghost in Hitler's mythology, a man whose flaws were alchemized into legacy, a necessary lie for a movement that needed founding fathers without fractures. But while Eckart's ghost was edited into sainthood, the next man's scars were too loud, too physical, and too close to the front line to ever fully disappear. 25. Sepp Dietrich. Sepp Dietrich didn't walk like a man shaped by ideology. He walked like a man stitched together by injury. One of the most decorated and publicly visible SS commanders, Dietrich carried the physical toll of his frontline past in plain sight. Multiple war injuries, shrapnel, bullet wounds, concussions, left him with lingering impairments, including chronic pain and possible traumatic brain injury. But instead of sidelining him, these wounds were rebranded. He wasn't injured. He was hardened. He wasn't impaired. He was living proof of battlefield devotion. In official imagery, Dietrich is all posture and medals. His gait is stiff, but never explained. His expressions, often blank or steely, could have been discipline or neurological fog. After the war, some Allied interrogators noted cognitive issues during questioning, slowness to respond, memory lapses, even confusion. Nothing diagnosed, of course. Just enough to raise quiet doubts. Still, within the Reich, Dietrich remained a symbol. He led with physicality, not strategy. He was loyalty incarnate, even when loyalty outweighed reason. His body may have failed in private, but in public, it was weaponized as myth. And maybe that's the final irony. In a regime built on eugenic perfection, it was the visibly broken who often rose the highest.